Hello, thank you for your interest. I'll be talking about persistence of heuristic protocols, the impact of Clement, Origen, and Evagrius on monastic pedagogy. For centuries, Byzantine monasticism continued to draw on late antique educational patterns, both echoes and developments of classical pedagogy, the paideia or paideia system. This is obvious, for instance, in the stages of the spiritual life, which mirror classical education and philosophical curricula. By cultivating these patterns, Byzantine monasticism tacitly acknowledged what it actually was, namely a Christian iteration of the classical and the late antique schools of philosophy. Here, philosophy must be understood in Pierre Hadot's sense as a way of life. For example, Nilas's ascetic discourse, Nilas died in about 430, considers Christianity a philosophical school and Christian ascetics true philosophers, the culmination of a philosophical quest begun centuries earlier. The fact that the modern edition of Nilas's work is found in the 18th century monastic collection of spiritual writings, the Philokalia, indicates the persistence of this perception throughout the Byzantine era and after. Indeed, following his lead, Byzantine ascetics continued to draw on late antique pedagogical devices. One such instrument is the use of indirect and enigmatic messages that require heuristic decoding of relevance here. Either way, for them, the spiritual life was a journey of discovery. The Philokalia includes an abundance of evidence to that effect. I begin with the title of the work, which in my translation reads, "The Philokalia of the Holy Sober Ones, collected from our holy and God-bearing fathers, on how the mind is purified, enlightened, and perfected by way of praxis and contemplation, which pertain to ethical philosophy." The reference to ethical philosophy denotes the understanding of monasticism as philosophy of life. More interesting about this title is the intimation that this collection of resources aims to guide ascetic practitioners on the path to perfection. To an extent it does, but readers find nothing as straightforward there as a handbook of monastic practice. The readers are left to draw their own conclusions, to flex their heuristic muscles, as it were. Another example is the prologue to one of the works collected in the Philokalia, Maximus the Confessor's Chapters on Love. Maximus lived in the 7th century. The author iterates the idea captured by the title of the collection, that is, the material presented in it originates in a variety of sources. In his words, "These chapters are not the products of my own mind. On the contrary, I have gone through the writings of the Holy Fathers and collected from them passages relevant to my subject, condensing much material into short paragraphs, and in this way making it easy to remember and to assimilate." In this case, the topic is straightforward, as Maximus chose to discuss how ascetic purification and progress in the spiritual life transform the person into a loving one. But, and more relevant, the prologue warns that the apparently simple advice proposed here should not deceive solitary readers, especially inexperienced ones. Maximus, again, please give careful attention to each chapter, for I suspect that not all of the chapters are easy for everyone to understand. It would be much better, he continues, to consider the content carefully by way of spiritual conversations with other ascetics, as signified by the noun synexetasis, which means rigorous and collective examination. This literature should not be taken at face value, and while synexetasis might not refer only to deploying heuristic devices, this is implied. Alongside many similar caveats, the writings collected between the Philokalia's covers present the reader with innumerable challenges, from conundrums to enigmatic statements, all of which requiring heuristic decoding. By all intents and purposes, this is indication that heuristic pedagogy remained normative for most of Nilas's and Maximus's successors in the monastic tradition. And while it would be interesting to explore the Philokalia further, I must now turn to three significant, though largely unacknowledged, sources of this tradition. I mean, of course, the heuristic protocols of Clement, Origen, and Evagrius. I pause here to give you a bit of background. What I have presented so far about the Philokalia and therefore monastic law, monastic wisdom, has to do with a lasting interest of mine in the ascetic literature. And actually, this very semester, I give a course at St. Cyril's Coptic College on the Philokalia and its sources. So somehow this paper draws on this immediate context and has to do with it. On the other hand, the witnesses of the earlier Christian tradition, Clement, Origen, and Evagrius, that I refer here, actually are another interest of mine. And I'm happy to point out the fact that in my 2021 book, Humankind and the Cosmos, Early Christian Representations, published in Braille, in two chapters, chapters 3 and 4, I discuss their contributions, including their heuristic pedagogy. Clement of Alexandria died in about 215. His educational strategies originated in the classical system, paideia, that prescribed gradual introduction into the art of thinking and living conducive to perfection. This accounts for his interest in personal transformation, higher knowledge, and holiness. He discovered proofs of spiritual and intellectual advancement in Panthenus, his teacher. He also reflected upon his own pursuit of wisdom and holiness. In the same vein, he contemplated a series of scriptural and contemporary paradigms from Abraham to Moses to Jesus' apostles to the early Christian martyrs. He reached the conclusion that the highest outcome of the transformative process is the holy Gnostic, the saintly sage whose knowledge is encyclopedic, whose discernment is sharp, and who teaches by way of heuristic devices and observes a strategy of concealment. Not everyone should be taught everything. According to Clement, after undertaking elementary learning, they who seek to become holy Gnostics must undergo a threefold curriculum prescribing advancement from ethics to physics to epoptics, or from virtuous formation to the contemplation of nature to the vision of the ultimate reality. This schedule emulates ancient philosophical curricula, both directly and under the guise of the familiar early Christian idea of stages of initiation. By the way, I have discussed this connection between philosophical curricula and stages of initiation in the Christian tradition in a recent actually book chapter, The Teacher and His School, Philosophical Representations of Jesus and Christianity, published in 2021 in the book The Impact of Jesus of Nazareth, Historical, Theological, and Pastoral Perspectives, produced by the Sydney College of Divinities Press. But for those of you who are interested in this topic, the idea of an ascension of the human being from the state of sinfulness to the highest level of holiness, You could read, for instance, a chapter that I thoroughly enjoy recommending by Bogdan Bucur, Hierarchy, Eldership, Evangelia, Clement of Alexandria, and the Ascetic Tradition, published in a volume that I co-edited some years ago, Alexandrian Legacy, a critical appraisal produced by Cambridge Scholars, so 2015. No wonder Clement called this threefold framework in a number of ways, such as Gnostic tradition, holy gnosis, and ecclesiastical gnosis. That said, his educational framework transcends basic catechism and ethical instruction, presenting strong intellectual, spiritual, and contemplative components, ultimately fostering deep learning, research skills, and dialectical thinking. It also encourages the application of discernment to matters natural and cultural, treated, as Judith Kovac noted, as mysteries to be deciphered. Clement's curriculum constitutes then an interdisciplinary platform for bridging the pursuit of holiness and a range of fields of study. Accordingly, its noblest outcome, the Holy Gnostic, embodies the virtues of a Christian saint together with the knowledge, the wisdom, and the skills of a classical sage. In classical fashion, indeed, the Holy Gnostic grasps things that elude all others. Also in classical fashion, he or she conceals the most profound truths from the untrained and the inexperienced. He or she is deliberate here. Clement was of the view that a Holy Gnostic is not characterized by gender, and he actually pointed out with clarity that both men and women can accede to that quality. It is as a Gnostic himself and for similarly trained people that Clement wrote most of his stromatis and all of his didaskalos, the teacher, many times setting traps for the mind that must prove its prowess with ciphers. In so doing, he set the foundations of heuristic pedagogy in the Christian tradition. Byzantine monastics have never balked from his wisdom, which they appropriated in the form of the gradual progress that the Philokalias title distinctly echoes. His pioneering work was not lost on his estranged pupil, Origen either. For Origen, who died in about 254, as for Clement, the subject of all experiences and the object of all investigations was the holy person called perfect or spiritual. No wonder the space he allocated for the threefold curriculum, undoubtedly in emulation of Clement's approach that maps the making of a holy sage. Considered through the lens of his late antique biographies, corroborated by internal evidence, it appears that what primarily informed his relevant views, again, as in Clement's case, is his own spiritual experience. In turn, his experience, magnified by his extensive training in the heuristic pedagogy of the ancients, profoundly shaped his literary output. Accordingly, most of his works address readers capable of assessing intellectual difficulties, interested in the spiritual life, and able to profit from his pedagogical approach. For example, as Charlotte Kirkert noted, his largely lost commentary on Genesis was written for his most advanced students. It would be only natural to examine his more speculative ideas in the light of this presupposition of which his disciples were aware. His intellectual forays were not meant for lazy students whom he did not welcome anyway. Trained in heuristic pedagogy, his students were equipped to think things through, to snatch the right conclusions out of a welter of speculation, to decode parables and metaphors, and to identify the spiritually formative message of the texts. His disciple, Gregory of Neo-Caesarea, supplies detailed accounts of his approach. This approach entails intricate mind games, which Origen conducted in a Socratic manner, and with which students were to grapple on their own together and in the presence of their master. Sometimes they were presented with multiple solutions to a certain issue, from which they had to choose what seemed plausible. The readers of the Philokalia and related literature are familiar with this educational approach, central to later monastic pedagogy. Some years ago, I've written an article on various such devices in the Byzantine tradition, and one of my paradigms was a section from the lengthy chapter on difficulty 10 by Maximus the Confessor, and I have pointed out there that he looked at the narrative in the Gospels of Jesus on Mount Tabor, we assume the Transfiguration event, in the company of two prophets, Moses and Elijah, and three apostles. There, Maximus provided, I think, 8 or 9 different levels of meaning for that narrative. It's mind-blowing. Yeah, Maximus being a representative of Middle Byzantine monastic tradition. Thus, Origen's discourse requires heuristic deciphering. It also requires awareness that his thinking arises from a perception of Christianity as existential, ethical, and practical philosophy. Indeed, he trained his disciples to discern the truth that builds life behind his parables, the enigmatic statements, and his grand cosmological narrative. Students were not to take things at face value. Instead, they were challenged to grasp the message dissimulated in the undergrowth of his hypotheses, including cosmological ones, that they might advance spiritually. On the principles, or periarchon, is illustrative of this heuristic gymnastic. To a large extent, the same goes for many writings penned by Evagrius Ponticus, who died in 399, Origen's admirer, but also Clement's, as Antoine Guillemot has proven. In like manner, Evagrius chose to present the spiritual experience under the guise of cosmological narratives, supposedly for the benefit of his monastic disciples. Contemporary scholars consider Evagrius the desert's metaphysician, without pausing to wonder how would cosmological speculation taken at face value nurture his ascetic students. As with Origen, Evagrius's hypothesis should be considered heuristic devices inviting existential decoding, not straightforward cosmological statements. And I have discussed this matter in a 2020 article, a note on Evagrius's cosmological and metaphysical statements in the Journal of Theological Studies. I have also addressed this matter from slightly different angles in my book in chapter 2. Here I take my cue from Augustine Cassidy, who rejected the view of Evagrius as a metaphysician. Central to Evagrius's mindset was monastic philosophy in the sense discussed above, or heuristic pedagogy, that focused upon articulating a lifestyle that leads to insight. It is the heuristic approach of monastic pedagogy that shaped his teaching into enigmatic sentences meant to stimulate inquisitiveness and reflection. The same pedagogy demands personal transformation as indispensable for grasping the message. Eagerness and mere analytical skills cannot suffice. As Cassidy noted, the reader, including the contemporary scholar, must attain spiritual maturity in order to grasp these metaphors and conundrums. Here is a concrete example. In Gnostic chapters 3:28, Evagrius describes the soul as a mind that through lack of vigilance fell from the primordial unity into the order of the practical life. And this is a paraphrase from the translation by Ilaria Rameli of the Syriac text of the chapters. Scholars take this passage metaphysically as concerning the transit of the spirit into the psychic condition of the second creation, technicalities of Evagrius's vocabulary. But Evagrius did not talk to metaphysicians. He articulated monastic life for a monastic audience, above all for his advanced students, whom he trained to solve such puzzles. To that end, he adopted and adapted Origen and Clement's heuristic protocols. Thus, most, if not all, of his metaphysical stances should be understood, at least on a certain hermeneutical level, as metaphorical depictions of monastic life, or parables. In monastic code, the passage in question speaks of the tests, turmoil, and dangers which advanced ascetics, gnostikoi, signified by the mind, faced during their journey, including the possibility of regressing to the status of praktikoi, beginners, signified by the soul or the psychic condition. The closing reference to practical life or basic asceticism leaves no doubt that this is what the passage means. And perhaps this is what many of Evagrius's cosmological statements mean. Heuristic pedagogy is not about providing straightforward answers, which were reserved for beginners and the uneducated, but about challenging the advanced disciples to work out solutions for themselves. When they read enigmatic statements, Evagrius' students were to infer the wisdom that guided their progress. Evagrius actually challenged the disciples themselves to crack the code. When they succeeded, they mirrored the stars above, as Evagrius had it, called to illumine those still in the darkness of ignorance. I shall close my presentation by pointing out that with Evagrius, the monastic movement set sail in the manner that has become normative for Byzantine monasticism. Even as late as the 18th century, his memory was treasured despite historical vicissitude. Indeed, one of the editors of the Philokalia, Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, introduced his writings by acknowledging him as the wise and eloquent man. But through Evagrius, Byzantine monasticism was entrusted with the wisdom of his sources, especially Clement and Origen, especially their heuristic pedagogy, which medieval ascetics cultivated with great reverence.